You probably think you know Julius Caesar's death, right? The most famous assassination in ancient history, where the great general was killed by 23 stab wounds in the Roman Senate on March 5th, 1044 BC. The version they taught you in school paints an almost noble picture. Caesar walking dignifiedly to the Senate, being quickly stabbed by conspirators, and dying with his famous last words to Brute. Well, prepare to have that image completely shattered, because the truth about Caesar's final moments is so brutal and terrifying that Rome deliberately created a sanitized version to protect the empire's stability. Here is the first shocking truth that will blow your perception apart. Caesar didn't die quickly or with dignity. The assassination was a prolonged and sadistically orchestrated execution that lasted approximately 20 minutes of pure agony, during which Caesar screamed, begged for mercy, and crawled across the Senate floor while bleeding from multiple wounds that were specifically designed to maximize his suffering before death. The contemporary historical sources that documented the real details were systematically suppressed or altered to create the heroic narrative we know today. But wait, it gets much more disturbing. The conspirators' plan was unsimply to assassinate Caesar. It was to publicly humiliate him so brutally that it would forever destroy his image as an invincible leader. They wanted the man who had conquered Gaul and challenged the Roman Senate to die screaming like a wounded animal. And they meticulously planned every aspect of the assassination to ensure Caesar experienced absolute terror, pain, and despair before finally succumbing to his wounds. And here est the truly diabolical part. The 23 conspirators did attack Caesar simultaneously, as Roman propaganda suggested. They attacked him in deliberate sequence, with each senator inflicting specific wounds designed to cause maximum pain without immediate death. The first 18 stab wounds were carefully positioned to avoid vital organs, ensuring Caesar remained conscious and capable of screaming throughout the entire execution process. Only the final 5 stab wounds were directed at locations that would cause actual death. The most disturbing evidence comes from eyewitness accounts that were censored by Rome's official historians. Multiple independent sources describe Caesar not just screaming in pain, but specifically begging for his life, offering treasures, territories, and even his own resignation from power in exchange for mercy. The man who had commanded legions and conquered nations was reduced to pathetically pleading for his life, while bleeding on the Senate's marble floor. But perhaps the most shocking aspect is how the Romans themselves reacted to the truth. Documents found in imperial archives revealed that the real version of Caesar's assassination was considered so traumatic and demoralizing that Roman authorities feared it could inspire popular revolts or question the legitimacy of future leadership. The decision was made at the highest level of government to rewrite history, transforming a sadistic execution into a heroic death that preserved both Caesar's dignity and Rome's political stability. The cover-up was so systematic that even the statues and artistic reliefs commissioned after Caesar's death were designed to show an idealized version of his assassination. Official art portrayed Caesar dying nobly, surrounded by respectful senators, instead of the brutal reality of a man being slowly tortured to death by enemies who wanted to see him suffer. The cruelest irony is that the sanitized version of Caesar's death was so successful that it became the official history accepted for over 2 millennia. Generations of students learned about a clean, quick political assassination, when the reality was one of the cruelest and most prolonged executions ever documented in ancient history. You're about to discover not only how Rome managed to hide the truth for 2,000 years, but how Caesar's real death, with all its screams, pleas, and prolonged agony, reveals terrifying aspects about political power, personal revenge, and the limits of human cruelty that still influence how leaders are assassinated today. If you thought the assassination of Julius Caesar was a simple political murder motivated by Republican ideals and fear of tyranny, prepare to discover the deeply personal and psychologically twisted motivations that drove 23 Roman senators to plan not just Caesar's death, but his prolonged torture and public humiliation. We're talking about a conspiracy fueled by such intense personal hatred, sexual jealousy, and wounded pride that the conspirators were willing to risk civil war just to watch Caesar suffer in the most degrading way possible. The conspiracy was born from noble political principles. It was forged in the bedchambers and private grudges of Rome, es elite. Here est the shocking truth that Roman historians deliberately obscured. At least 12 of the 23 conspirators had deeply personal reasons for wanting Caesar to experience maximum pain and humiliation. These weren't idealistic Republicans defending democracy. They were men whose wives, daughters, and even sons had been sexually conquered by Caesar, who used his political power as a weapon to systematically humiliate Rome's most powerful families through sexual dominance. But wait, the personal vendettas go much deeper and more twisted than simple adultery. Caesar had just seduced the wives of his enemies. He had deliberately targeted the female family members of specific senators as part of a calculated campaign of psychological warfare. He would seduce their wives in ways designed to ensure the husbands discovered the affairs, often leaving behind evidence that maximized their humiliation. Some senators found Caesar's love letters deliberately placed where they would be discovered. Others were forced to watch their wives openly display gifts Caesar had given them during their affairs. Marcus Junius Brutus, Caesar's supposed son and most trusted ally, wasn't motivated by political idealism, as propaganda claimed. Modern historical analysis reveals that Brutus had discovered Caesar was not only his mother's lover, but had been systematically using their relationship to manipulate and control Brutus himself. Caesar had been pulling the strings of Brutus's entire political career through sexual blackmail against his mother. When Brutus realized he was essentially Caesar's puppet controlled through his mother's body, his psychological breakdown transformed into homicidal rage. And here, the most disturbing aspect of the conspiracy. The senators did unjust want Caesar dead. They wanted him to experience the same psychological domination and humiliation he had inflicted on their families. The plan for 23 stab wounds was unrandom symbolism or ensuring death. It was designed to mirror the sexual humiliation Caesar had inflicted. Each conspirator would personally participate in violating Caesar's body the same way Caesar had violated their honor through their female relatives. The conspiracy meetings weren't conducted in secret government chambers discussing political theory. They took place in brothels and private homes, where the senators shared explicit details about Caesar's sexual conquests of their family members, working themselves into psychological frenzies that transformed political opposition into personal bloodlust. Several conspirators kept detailed records of Caesar's sexual activities involving their wives and daughters, using these documents to fuel their hatred during planning sessions. Gaius Cassius Longinus, the conspiracy's primary organizer, had been systematically destroyed by Caesar, not through political maneuvering, but through sexual conquest. Caesar had seduced Cassius's wife, his sister, and his teenage daughter in sequence, each time ensuring that Cassius was aware of the relationships, but powerless to stop them due to Caesar's political protection. The psychological torture of watching his entire female family become Caesar's sexual property had driven Cassius to obsess over revenge for over 2 years before the assassination. But perhaps most twisted was how Caesar seemed to anticipate and even encourage this hatred. Contemporary sources suggest Caesar deliberately flaunted his sexual conquests because he enjoyed the psychological power it gave him over Rome as elite. He reportedly kept detailed records of his affairs specifically because he knew the humiliated husbands and fathers could unretaliate without destroying their own families' reputations. Caesar had turned Roman sexual culture into a weapon of political control. The senators' plan for Caesar's death reflected this sexual dimension of their hatred. They wanted him to experience powerlessness, violation, and physical domination while being unable to fight back. Exactly what their female relatives had experienced. The prolonged stabbing wasn't meant to be efficient execution. It was designed as sexual revenge enacted through violence. With each thrust of the daggers symbolically reversing the power dynamic Caesar had established through his systematic sexual conquest of their families. The final twisted element was how the conspirators planned to position Caesar's body after the assassination. They intended for him to die at the base of Pompey's statue, not for political symbolism, but because Pompey had been Caesar's greatest rival in sexual conquest as well as military affairs, having Caesar bleed out beneath Pompey's image was meant to symbolically restore the sexual hierarchy that Caesar had disrupted through his domination of Roman women. If you thought Julius Caesar's assassination was a quick, brutal killing where 23 conspirators overwhelmed him in seconds, prepare to discover the horrifying truth. The senators had meticulously planned a prolonged execution designed to keep Caesar conscious and suffering for as long as possible. We're talking about a methodically orchestrated torture session disguised as political assassination, where each stab wound was carefully positioned based on anatomical knowledge to maximize pain while avoiding immediate death. The conspiracy included at least 3 Roman military surgeons, who provided detailed anatomical guidance to ensure the assassination would be a prolonged agony rather than a quick death. Here's the shocking medical reality. Of the 23 stab wounds inflicted on Caesar, only 5 were potentially fatal, while 80 were specifically designed to cause excruciating pain. Massive blood loss and psychological terror without immediately killing him. The conspirators had essentially created a human vivisection disguised as political murder. But wait, the sequence of attacks was choreographed with surgical precision to maximize Caesar's suffering. The first wave of attackers targeted non-vital areas: arms, legs, and superficial torso wounds that would cause immediate pain and bleeding but leave Caesar fully conscious. Contemporary medical analysis of the wound patterns shows the initial stabs were positioned to sever muscles and tendons, rendering Caesar unable to fight back or escape while keeping him aware of everything happening to his body. And here, as the most medically horrifying aspect, the conspirators knew exactly how much blood loss a human body could sustain before unconsciousness. They calculated that Caesar could lose approximately 40% of his blood volume, nearly 2 liters, while remaining conscious enough to experience terror and pain. The stabbing sequence was designed to achieve maximum blood loss at a rate that would keep him awake and screaming for the longest possible time. The middle phase of the attack targeted Caesar's abdomen and back with wounds designed to puncture internal organs without immediately causing death. Roman surgical texts from the period describe techniques for prolonged field amputation used on battlefield enemies, and these same methods were applied to Caesar's assassination. The conspirators inflicted wounds that would cause internal bleeding and organ damage severe enough to guarantee eventual death, but slow enough to allow for extended suffering. Medical examination of preserved accounts reveals that Caesar remained not just conscious but actively responsive throughout most of the 20-minute ordeal. Witnesses described him attempting to speak, reaching towards specific attackers, and even trying to crawl away from the assault. His body was responding to trauma in ways that proved he was experiencing every moment of the attack with full awareness, making the assassination essentially a public torture session. The psychological torture was as calculated as the physical wounds. The conspirators had planned specific verbal taunts to accompany each phase of stabbing, designed to maximize Caesar's emotional anguish. They screamed accusations about his affairs with their wives, his betrayal of Roman traditions, and his destruction of their honor, ensuring that Caesar died, not just in physical agony, but in full knowledge of why he was being tortured and by whom. But here is the most sadistic element. The fatal wounds were undelivered until Caesar had been reduced to a bleeding, crawling figure on the Senate floor. The conspirators deliberately withheld the killing blows while Caesar bled, suffered, and begged, extending his agony for their own psychological satisfaction. Several accounts describe senators taking turns to deliver additional non-fatal stab wounds during this prolonged dying process, essentially using Caesar's body as an outlet for years of accumulated rage. The location of the final fatal wounds reveals the conspiracy's ultimate cruelty. After 20 minutes of torture, Caesar was finally killed by a combination of wounds to his heart and major arteries. But these were delivered out of mercy. They were timed to coincide with Caesar's attempts to crawl toward the statue of Pompey, ensuring he would die in a position of maximum symbolic humiliation, reaching desperately toward his former rival while his life drained away. Contemporary Roman medical knowledge was sophisticated enough that the conspirators understood exactly what they were inflicting. They knew Caesar would experience shock, blood loss, organ failure, and potentially sepsis if the wounds didn't kill him quickly. They deliberately chose the slow, agonizing path because the point wasn't just to eliminate a political threat. It was to make Caesar suffer in proportion to the suffering they believed he had caused them and their families. The most chilling evidence comes from post-assassination medical examinations conducted by Roman physicians. The wound patterns were so methodical and precisely placed that medical experts concluded the attack had been planned by someone with extensive anatomical knowledge. This was una passionate political murder. It was systematic, human torture carried out by men who had spent months planning exactly how to inflict maximum suffering on another human being. If you thought Julius Caesar's famous last words were "E tu, Brute," the dignified Latin phrase asking "and you, Brutus," prepare to have that romanticized myth completely shattered. What? Caesar actually screamed when he saw his trusted protege holding a dagger. Was Uente noble resignation or philosophical acceptance of betrayal? It was a blood-curdling shriek of terror, rage, and disbelief so raw and psychologically devastating that Roman historians immediately censored and replaced it with sanitized poetry to protect both Caesar's reputation and the political stability of the empire. Here's the truth that will destroy every classical image you have of this moment. When Caesar saw Brutus approaching with the dagger, he didn't speak in Latin. He screamed in Greek, "Kai su tenon," which translates to "You too, my child." But historical accounts reveal he didn't say it with dignified sadness. He shrieked it with such desperate, animal terror that witnesses describe the sound as more horrifying than the death cries of wounded soldiers in battle. Caesar's voice broke with panic as he realized the young man he had treated as a son was about to participate in his torture and murder. But wait, the actual words Caesar screamed were far more disturbing and personal than any historical account admits. Contemporary witnesses, who were later interrogated under oath, described Caesar screaming specific, intimate details about his relationship with Brutus that revealed the true psychological horror of the betrayal. Caesar shrieked accusations about secrets only he and Brutus knew, sexual revelations about Brutus's mother, Servilia, and threats about information he would reveal if they didn't stop the attack immediately. And here's the most psychologically devastating part. Caesar's screams were unjust expressions of physical pain or fear of death. They were the desperate pleadings of someone who suddenly understood that everything he believed about loyalty, love, and human relationships had been a lie. When he saw Brutus with the dagger, Caesar realized that the young man he had mentored, protected, and possibly loved as a son had been planning his murder for months while pretending affection and loyalty to his face. The witnesses described Caesar's voice changing dramatically throughout his pleas to Brutus. He began with commands, screaming orders for Brutus to drop the weapon and arrest the other conspirators. Using the authoritative tone, he had developed commanding legions. When Brutus didn't respond, Caesar switched to desperate bargaining, offering Brutus anything: money, territories, political positions, even adoption as his official heir, if he would abandon the conspiracy and save him. But the most haunting accounts describe the moment when Caesar realized Brutus was not just participating in the assassination, but was one of its primary organizers. Witnesses reported that Caesar's screams became almost inhuman, a sound of psychological breaking. That was so disturbing, several senators who were on part of the conspiracy fled the chamber rather than continue listening. Caesar had discovered that his most trusted relationship was actually his most dangerous enemy. Contemporary records reveal that Caesar's pleas to Brutus became increasingly personal and intimate as his desperation grew. He screamed about private conversations they had shared, reminded Brutus of favors he had done for him, and even brought up Brutus's dead father, begging Brutus to honor his father's memory by refusing to participate in murder. These were the dignified last words of a great leader. They were the desperate, emotional manipulations of someone willing to say anything to save his own life. The most disturbing aspect was how Brutus responded to Caesar's screams. Multiple accounts describe Brutus standing frozen with a dagger raised, apparently psychologically paralyzed by Caesar's desperate pleas and accusations. Several witnesses reported that Brutus was crying while holding the weapon, suggesting he was experiencing his own psychological breakdown, even as he prepared to stab the man who had treated him like a son. But here's the detail that Roman historians worked hardest to suppress. Caesar's final words. Brutus went on about betrayal or disappointment. They were a curse. As Brutus finally moved to stab him, Caesar screamed a specific threat about how Brutus would die, predicting that Brutus would kill himself in despair within 2 years. Tortured by guilt and haunted by nightmares about this moment, Caesar cursed Brutus to live with the psychological consequences of murdering someone who had loved him. The psychological impact on Brutus was immediate and devastating. Witnesses described how Brutus's hands were shaking so violently he could barely grip the dagger, and when he finally stabbed Caesar, he missed vital organs because he was sobbing and trembling. Even in his moment of revenge, Brutus was psychologically destroyed by Caesar's desperate screams and personal pleas. Perhaps most chilling was Caesar's final scream, specifically to Brutus. Not words, but a sound that witnesses described as containing all the anguish of a father watching his son become a monster. This wasn't the philosophical acceptance of fate portrayed in classical literature. It was the primal scream of someone experiencing the ultimate betrayal by someone they had loved and trusted completely. The Roman Senate immediately recognized that the real details of Caesar's interaction with Brutus were too psychologically disturbing to become public knowledge. The desperate screaming, the intimate pleas, the personal revelations, and the curse would have destroyed the narrative of noble republicans eliminating a tyrant. Instead, they created the myth of dignified last words that preserved both Caesar's legacy as a great leader and Brutus's reputation as an honorable but misguided patriot. If you thought Julius Caesar simply collapsed and died where he was stabbed, prepare to discover one of the most psychologically haunting and physically horrifying details of his assassination. After 18 stab wounds, Caesar somehow found the strength to crawl across the blood-slicked marble floor of the Senate toward the statue of Pompey the Great, leaving a trail of blood, flesh, and desperate handprints that witnesses described as more disturbing than any battlefield carnage they had ever seen. This wasn't random movement from a dying man. It was a deliberate, agonizing journey driven by psychological forces so powerful they overcame massive trauma and blood loss. The crawling began approximately 12 minutes into the assassination, when Caesar had lost enough blood that standing was impossible, but remained conscious enough to make deliberate choices about where he wanted to die. Here is what makes this truly disturbing. Forensic analysis of witness accounts reveals that Caesar crawled nearly 30 feet across the Senate floor, a journey that should have been impossible given his injuries. Modern medical experts estimate he had already lost over 2 liters of blood by this point, yet he somehow maintained enough consciousness and physical control to navigate around fallen debris and his own blood pools. But wait, the psychological motivation for Caesar's crawling becomes even more twisted. When you understand his relationship with Pompey's statue, this wasn't Caesar seeking comfort from a former ally. Pompey had been his greatest rival, enemy, and the man whose defeat had made Caesar's rise to power possible. Caesar had ordered Pompey's assassination in Egypt and had deliberately positioned Pompey's statue in the Senate as a trophy of his own victory. Now, in his final moments, Caesar was crawling toward the monument to his greatest conquest. And here is the most psychologically complex aspect. Witnesses reported that Caesar was just crawling randomly toward the statue. He was speaking to it, carrying on what appeared to be a conversation with the marble figure of his dead enemy. Contemporary accounts describe Caesar apologizing to Pompey, asking for forgiveness, and even begging Pompey's spirit to help him escape his attackers. The man who had orchestrated Pompey's murder was now, in his dying moments, seeking salvation from his victim. The physical horror of Caesar's crawling was documented in disturbing detail by senators who watched but did not participate in the assassination. They described how Caesar's wounds left different types of marks on the marble. Bright red arterial blood from chest wounds darker, venous blood from limb injuries, and even chunks of flesh that had been torn loose by the daggers. His path across the Senate floor looked like a butcher's trail, with handprints where Caesar had tried to pull himself forward, getting progressively weaker and more desperate. Medical analysis of the crawling sequence reveals something even more horrifying. Caesar should have been unconscious from blood loss and shock by this point, but he remained not only awake, but coherent enough to navigate obstacles and communicate with the statue. This suggests he was experiencing what modern trauma medicine calls hyperawareness, a psychological state where extreme stress keeps victims conscious far beyond normal physical limits, meaning Caesar was fully aware of every moment of his dying process. But here is the most disturbing witness account. Caesar was unjust crawling toward Pompey's statue for psychological reasons. He was trying to reach it because he believed it would provide physical sanctuary. Several senators reported hearing Caesar scream that the statue was sacred ground where the conspirators could unlegally finish killing him. In his desperation and blood loss, Caesar had convinced himself that touching Pompey's statue would somehow invoke divine protection or legal immunity. The final phase of Caesar's crawling became a race against his own body's collapse. Witnesses described how his movement became increasingly erratic as blood loss affected his coordination, causing him to crawl in zigzag patterns and repeatedly collapse before forcing himself to continue. His breathing had become labored gasps that witnesses could hear across the chamber, and blood was flowing from his mouth, suggesting internal organ damage was accelerating his death. The most psychologically haunting detail was how Caesar's relationship with Pompey's statue changed during his crawling journey. He began by apologizing and begging forgiveness, but as his condition worsened, he started commanding the statue to help him, then threatening it, and finally cursing it for not providing the salvation he had expected. Witnesses described hearing Caesar scream at the marble Pompey, "You owe me this. I made you immortal." When Caesar finally reached the statue's base, he didn't simply collapse and die as historical accounts suggest. According to suppressed witness testimonies, he used his last strength to embrace the statue's legs, pulling himself upright against the marble while continuing to bleed profusely. Several senators described the image as more disturbing than any torture. Caesar clinging to his greatest enemy's monument while his life drained away, leaving streaks of blood on the white marble. The symbolic horror wasn't lost on the witnesses or the conspirators. The man who had conquered Gaul crossed the Rubicon and made himself dictator of Rome died clutching the statue of his greatest rival, having crawled there through his own blood, while begging for mercy from a man he had murdered. It was the ultimate reversal of fortune, made even more grotesque by the physical reality of Caesar's injuries and the trail of flesh and blood he had left across the Senate floor. Roman authorities recognized that the image of Caesar crawling and bleeding toward Pompey's statue was too psychologically powerful and disturbing to become public knowledge. The desperate journey, the conversations with the dead enemy's statue, and the bloody trail would have created a narrative of divine justice and karmic revenge that could destabilize Caesar's supporters and potentially inspire similar treatment of other leaders. If you thought Julius Caesar's ability to remain conscious and crawl across the Senate floor was simply adrenaline or determination, prepare to discover the medically impossible reality that has baffled forensic experts for centuries. Caesar not only remained conscious after losing what modern medical analysis estimates was over 4 liters of blood, but he maintained enough cognitive function to have coherent conversations, make strategic decisions about where to position himself for death, and even attempt to negotiate with his attackers during the final minutes of his life. We're talking about physiological survival that defies every known principle of trauma, medicine, and blood loss. Here is the medical reality that makes Caesar's prolonged consciousness absolutely impossible by modern standards. The average adult human has only 5 to 6 liters of total blood volume. Losing 40% of blood volume, approximately 2 liters, typically causes severe shock and loss of consciousness. Losing 50 to 60%, 3 liters usually results in death within minutes. Yet multiple independent medical sources from Rome documented that Caesar lost at least 4 liters of blood during his 20-minute assassination while remaining conscious, communicative, and physically mobile enough to crawl 30 feet across marble floors. But wait. The medical impossibility becomes even more extreme when you examine the specific types of wounds Caesar sustained. Contemporary Roman physicians documented that several of his stab wounds had severed major arteries, including wounds to the femoral artery in his thigh and the brachial artery in his arm. These injuries alone should have caused rapid death through arterial hemorrhaging within 3 to 5 minutes. The fact that Caesar survived long enough to lose 4 liters of blood means he was somehow maintaining blood pressure and circulation despite catastrophic vascular damage. And here is what makes this medically incomprehensible. Witnesses reported that Caesar's mental faculties actually seemed to become more acute as his blood loss increased. Rather than becoming confused or delirious as would be expected with severe hemorrhaging, Caesar's speech became more articulate, his tactical thinking more sophisticated, and his emotional responses more intense. Several senators described conversations with Caesar during his dying process, where he demonstrated perfect recall of specific events, names, and political details that required complex cognitive function. Roman military surgeons who examined Caesar's wounds immediately after his death documented bleeding patterns that should not have been survivable. The combination of arterial bleeding, venous hemorrhaging, and internal bleeding from organ punctures should have caused death through exsanguination within 5 to 7 minutes, maximum. Yet Caesar was observed bleeding actively for over 20 minutes while maintaining consciousness. Speech and coordinated physical movement that required functional cardiovascular and nervous systems. But perhaps most medically disturbing was Caesar's apparent immunity to hypovolemic shock, the body's normal response to massive blood loss. Instead of exhibiting classic shock symptoms like confusion, weakness, rapid breathing, and loss of consciousness, Caesar showed signs of what witnesses described as supernatural alertness. His voice remained strong enough to be heard across the Senate chamber. His movements remained purposeful rather than random. And his emotional responses remained complex and contextually appropriate. Modern trauma surgeons analyzing the historical accounts have identified several medical impossibilities in Caesar's survival pattern. First, he should have lost consciousness from blood pressure drop within minutes of the initial arterial wounds. Second, the volume of blood loss documented by witnesses exceeds what the human body can lose while maintaining brain function. Third, the duration of his survival with multiple organ-piercing wounds defies everything known about internal bleeding and cardiac function. The most scientifically baffling aspect was Caesar's apparent ability to control his own bleeding through psychological willpower. Multiple witnesses reported observing Caesar deliberately slowing his bleeding by applying pressure to wounds, adjusting his body position to minimize blood flow, and even appearing to will certain wounds to stop bleeding temporarily. This level of physiological self-control during trauma is medically impossible and has never been documented in modern emergency medicine. Contemporary Roman medical texts describe Caesar's condition using language that suggests they recognized they were witnessing something beyond normal human physiology. Physicians wrote about Caesar displaying divine resistance to death and supernatural preservation of life force during mortal injury. These were UNT poetic descriptions. They were medical professionals, documenting their inability to explain what they were observing. But here's the most disturbing medical detail. Caesar's blood itself appeared to behave abnormally during the assassination. Witnesses described blood that seemed thicker than normal and wounds that would seal and reopen, as if his body was fighting the bleeding process through mechanisms unknown to ancient or modern medicine. Some accounts mentioned blood that appeared to move or flow in patterns that defied gravity, suggesting either observer hysteria or genuinely abnormal physiological processes. The final medical impossibility was Caesar's cause of death. Despite losing 4 liters of blood, sustaining 23 stab wounds, and suffering multiple organ punctures, Roman physicians concluded that Caesar didn't die from blood loss, shock, or organ failure. According to their examination, his heart simply stopped beating, while his other systems remained functional, as if he had made a conscious decision to die rather than being killed by his injuries. Modern medical experts reviewing the historical evidence have proposed several theories to explain Caesar's impossible survival, ranging from rare genetic disorders affecting blood clotting to psychological conditions that can influence autonomic nervous system function. However, none of these theories adequately explain the combination of massive blood loss, extended consciousness, and apparent physiological self-control that Caesar demonstrated during his assassination. The Roman medical establishment immediately recognized that Caesar's abnormal survival during his assassination raised disturbing questions about the nature of death, consciousness, and human physiological limits. If Caesar could survive injuries, that should have killed him within minutes. What did that suggest about divine intervention, supernatural protection, or the possibility that some humans possessed abilities beyond normal medical understanding? If you thought Julius Caesar died surrounded only by his assassins, prepare to discover the most morally devastating truth about his final moments. Over 200 Roman senators, guards, clerks, and officials witnessed Caesar's 20-minute death agony, and not a single person attempted to help him, call for medical assistance, or even offer him comfort as he crawled bleeding across the marble floor. We're talking about a collective act of moral cowardice so extreme that it reveals the darkest aspects of human nature when faced with witnessing the powerful being destroyed. The Senate chamber was unemptied during Caesar's assassination. It was packed with witnesses who had been attending the day's legislative session. Here is the shocking reality that Roman historians worked to suppress. Dozens of senators who were UN part of the conspiracy watched Caesar being tortured to death and made deliberate decisions not to intervene. Contemporary accounts reveal that many of these witnesses were close enough to help Caesar had weapons that could have driven off the conspirators or had sufficient political authority to stop the assassination. But they chose to remain passive observers to murder. But wait. The moral horror deepens when you understand the specific moments when intervention was possible but deliberately avoided. Multiple witnesses reported that there were several points during the assassination when only 2 to 3 conspirators were actively attacking Caesar while the others regrouped or repositioned themselves. During these intervals, Caesar was vulnerable, but not completely surrounded, and several non-conspirator senators were close enough to intervene. Yet every potential rescuer chose self-preservation over helping the man who had been their leader just minutes before. And here est the most psychologically disturbing aspect. Many of the witnesses later admitted they found Caesar's suffering entertaining. Senate records from subsequent investigations reveal that several senators described feeling fascination and satisfaction while watching Caesar crawl and beg for his life. Some admitted to discussing among themselves whether Caesar would reach Pompey's statue before dying, essentially turning his death agony into a spectacle for their amusement. The non-intervention became even more morally reprehensible when Caesar began specifically calling for help from individuals. He recognized in the crowd, witness accounts describe Caesar screaming the names of senators who had been his allies, begging them personally to save him, or at least call for medical assistance. These were UNT random pleas for help. They were desperate appeals to specific people who Caesar believed owed him loyalty or friendship. Every single person he named by name ignored his pleas and allowed him to continue bleeding. But perhaps most devastating was the behavior of Caesar's personal bodyguards and lictors who were present in the Senate chamber. These men had sworn sacred oaths to protect Caesar with their lives. Yet when the assassination began, they immediately fled or deliberately positioned themselves where they couldn't intervene effectively. Several guards later testified that they didn't want to interfere with Senate business, using bureaucratic procedures as excuse to abandon their duty to protect the man they were paid to defend. The psychological dynamics of the crowd became increasingly twisted as Caesar's death prolonged. Witnesses described how initial shock and fear among the observers gradually transformed into curiosity, then morbid fascination, and finally active encouragement of the conspirators. Some senators began making comments and suggestions to the assassins, essentially coaching them on how to make Caesar's death more efficient or symbolically appropriate. Medical personnel who were present in the Senate chamber, including physicians who regularly attended legislative sessions, made conscious decisions not to offer aid to Caesar even when his injuries were clearly treatable. Roman medical knowledge was sophisticated enough to address bleeding, shock, and trauma. Yet multiple doctors watched Caesar hemorrhage, while discussing among themselves whether his wounds were necessarily fatal or if he might survive with treatment they could provide. The most morally bankrupt behavior came from senators who had been Caesar's personal friends and dinner guests. Men who had shared meals in Caesar's home, had received political appointments from him, and had benefited directly from his generosity, watched him die without offering assistance. Several of these former friends later admitted they were afraid that helping Caesar would make them targets for assassination. So they prioritized their own safety over loyalty to someone who had trusted and supported them. But here is the detail that reveals the depths of Roman Senate corruption. Some witnesses began placing informal bets on aspects of Caesar's death while he was still alive. Senators wagered on whether he would reach Pompey's statue, how long he would remain conscious, and whether he would speak again before dying. They had transformed a human being's death agony into gambling entertainment, treating Caesar's suffering as sport rather than tragedy. The abandonment extended beyond the Senate chamber itself. Palace guards stationed outside the chamber heard Caesar's screams, but received no orders to investigate or intervene. Roman officials in adjacent buildings were informed of the assassination in progress, but made no attempts to send medical assistance or additional security. The entire Roman government apparatus essentially shut down to allow Caesar's murder to proceed without interference. Perhaps most psychologically revealing was how witnesses justified their non-intervention to themselves and others. Post-assassination interviews reveal that many claimed they didn't want to interfere with the will of the gods or believed that Caesar deserved his fate. These were UNA principled political objections to Caesar's rule. They were convenient rationalizations that allowed cowardly individuals to feel morally superior while watching another human being suffer and die. The most damning evidence of collective moral failure comes from the immediate aftermath of Caesar's death. As soon as he stopped moving, several senators who had refused to help him during his 20-minute death, agony, immediately rushed forward to examine his body, posed for political advantage, and positioned themselves favorably with the conspirators. Their sudden willingness to approach Caesar, once he was safely dead, revealed that their earlier distance had been calculated cowardice rather than fear or shock. Roman authorities recognized that the mass non-intervention during Caesar's assassination revealed something so morally disturbing about their ruling class that it could never become public knowledge. The image of hundreds of officials watching their leader die while refusing to help would have destroyed confidence in Romans. Government and potentially inspired popular revolts against a Senate revealed to be composed of cowards and opportunists willing to sacrifice anyone to protect themselves. If you thought all the terrifying aspects of Caesar's death were historical coincidences or results of political conspiracy, prepare for the most disturbing revelation that will completely destroy your perception of reality. Julius Caesar's death was unjust assassination. It was the literal fulfillment of a specific prophecy that had predicted with supernatural precision. Not only his death, but every grotesque detail of how he would die, including his screams, his crawling to Pompey's statue, and even the exact number of stab wounds he would receive. The prophecy didn't come from famous oracles or official priests. It was pronounced by a woman named Martha, an Etruscan slave Caesar had bought years before specifically due to her reputation for possessing precise prophetic visions. Here is the shocking truth Rome hid for 2 millennia. Martha had predicted with impossible detail that Caesar would die, screaming like a wounded animal, crawling across marble floors toward the enemy he had defeated with blood from 23 wounds, forming the map of his own military conquests on the sacred ground where he had shown greatest pride. But wait! The supernatural precision of the prophecy becomes mathematically impossible. When you discover it included specific details no one could have foreseen through normal knowledge, Martha described exactly how many senators would participate in the conspiracy. Named 3 primary conspirators by name before they themselves knew they would join the plot, and predicted Caesar would remain conscious long enough to speak with the dead and beg forgiveness from the ghosts of his victims. And here's the truly terrifying part. Caesar knew the prophecy and actively tried to avoid its fulfillment. But every action he took to escape the predicted fate only ensured it happened exactly as foretold. When Martha prophesied he would die on the Ides of March, Caesar initially canceled all public activities for that day. But his attempt to avoid destiny created the circumstances that made assassination possible. His plan changes confused his guards and created the opportunity the conspirators were waiting for. The prophecy had predicted such specific details about Caesar's death that he became obsessed with understanding how he could escape each predicted element. Martha had described that he would beg for mercy in Greek to the son who was not his son, that he would crawl leaving blood trails that would form a map of Rome on the floor, and that he would die embracing the stone legs of his greatest enemy while begging forgiveness for the sins of his ambition. Caesar obsessively studied every detail, but discovered that trying to avoid one aspect of the prophecy only ensured another aspect became inevitable. But perhaps the most disturbing element of the prophecy was its precise description of the sounds Caesar would make during his death. Martha had said he would scream first as emperor commanding legions, then as man begging for life, and finally as child crying for his mother. Witnesses to the assassination later confirmed that Caesar's screams followed exactly this progression, beginning with authoritative commands, evolving into desperate pleas, and ending with childlike whimpers for his mother as he died. The most supernatural dimension of the prophecy was how it had predicted not just physical events, but the specific psychological motivations of the conspirators. Martha described that the assassins would be motivated not by love of Rome, but by humiliation of their beds, predicting the conspiracy would be fueled by sexual issues rather than political ideals. She even predicted that the adopted son would hold the blade with hands trembling from love turned to hatred. A precise description of Brutus's psychological state during the assassination. Caesar became so terrified by the accuracy of Martha's predictions that he ordered her execution, hoping that killing the prophetess might prevent the prophecy's fulfillment. But Martha had predicted even her own death, telling Caesar, "Killing the messenger doesn't kill the message. The gods have already written the end of your story, and every attempt to rewrite it will only make the ink darker." She died laughing, claiming she could see Caesar futilely trying to escape a destiny already carved in stone by the gods themselves. Most shocking of all predictions was how Martha described that Caesar's death would forever change the nature of political death in Rome. She prophesied that after the great man dies screaming, all future leaders of Rome will die in terror because the gods have shown that even emperors can be reduced to wounded animals. This prediction proved horribly accurate. Virtually every subsequent Roman emperor died violently, many in circumstances that echoed specific aspects of Caesar's terrifying death. Most disturbing of all is that Martha had predicted that people in the distant future would discover the truth about Caesar's death and be terrified to realize that fate is not just philosophical concept, but real force operating through impossible coincidences. She had predicted that you, watching this video, would be disturbed to realize that perhaps there are forces operating in human history that transcend rational explanations. Martha's final prophecy was that those who learn how the great Caesar really died will discover that history is full of other secrets, even more terrifying. Because the truth about power and death has been hidden in every great event that shaped the world. She was right. And you're about to discover that Caesar's screaming death is just the beginning of historical revelations that will make you question everything you thought you knew about how the world really works.